Hey guys, my name is Seth. This is SageSmokeSurvival, and I'm going to show you how to make an oil lamp today of a design you've probably never seen. I love this design of oil lamp because it can burn pretty much any fuel, solid or liquid. It all works in this. Most oil lamps require a liquid fuel. Since these lamps are more versatile with the state of matter their fuel is in, I like to call them fat lamps. Animal fat is the most frequent thing I burn in them. It's convenient because once you're done using the lamp, you can let it cool down and it will solidify in the lamp, making it easy for transportation. You don't need to worry about that liquid spilling out. You can even burn them with wax if you want, and then it's like an overpowered candle. They brighten up a room really efficiently. It's like having a few candles burning at once. The design itself is actually Scandinavian in origin, at least to my knowledge. They were often carved from soapstone. There's been a few archaeological finds. I make these out of wild clay instead, giving it that primitive feel. Clay is a great material for it. Sculpting from clay is a little bit easier than carving soapstone. Hundreds of cultures all over the world depended on pottery, so I've been doing a lot with wild clay lately, showing how to recreate some of these ancient types of pottery. I love it because you can find the clay in nature and make functional pottery there. And since this is such a versatile lamp design, I thought I would show you all how to make it. They output enough light, you can light up a whole tent pretty efficiently with just one or two. Not only that, but as you'll see in this video, it actually puts off enough heat you can melt things. If you put two of these lamps together, you could cook over it. This video is basically a complete guide on primitive pottery. It shows every step from finding wild clay to foraging your own temper for it. That way it can survive this particular firing process. Hydrating it, mixing it, the sculpting techniques used, burnishing, drying, warming it up, and actually firing it in an open fire. All in nature with primitive or simple tools like a knife I use at one point. This method of making pottery is one of the oldest, but it's ultra functional. You can make pottery almost anywhere you go that has wild clay, which is most places on Earth. These lamps are a fun beginner project, especially if you can make a bunch at once. I've taken them out camping with me and they're a lot of fun to use. So let's get into it. When looking for wild clay, you want to find cut banks or exposed soil. That's usually an indication of clay, because not a lot of plants like to grow in heavy clay soil. This is a cliff that was exposed by a nearby road cutting through a hill. I use this clay quite a bit because it's really stable and actually doesn't need any temper to be added. It has naturally occurring mica in it that works really nicely as a natural temper. So since this clay is pure with just a little bit of naturally occurring temper, I only need to add water to it and then sculpt. The real principle here is it's easiest to find clay where there's lots of erosion. This is an extreme example of that. Finding these cliffs is not very common, but finding smaller versions of these is quite common. You can see there's this band of black clay running through, with white clay above it and below it. I mostly collect the white clay, but I also get a little bit of the gray stuff in there. The clay in that black stripe is a little bit more plastic. It sculpts easier, but it cracks really easily when drying. So with just a little added to the more stable, light-colored clay, it makes a really nice mix. I'm always really careful working around this cliff because, as you can see, there's some pretty big fissures. I don't want to cause a landslide or have part of the cliff crumble down on me. A large bucket or a bag like this is great for collecting dry clay. Some clay sources I go to have wet clay. Big blocks of clay fall off this cliff all the time, and in the winter when I harvested this clay, those blocks will hydrate up with a bit of rainfall and crack as they dry. They'll do that over and over until they pretty much disintegrate into the soil around them. It's a muddy mess getting up and down this slope because clay is a major component of mud. Clay is what makes mud sticky. So anytime the mud is sticking to your boots really badly, that's because of high clay. Here I have a different clay that I actually harvest wet, but I allowed this stuff to dry. This clay needs a fair amount of temper added to it for it to work well, so I'm using it because it's a better representation of what you'll usually have to do when you find a new clay source. Dig your clay, let it dry, hydrate it to the point that you want. We do that by overhydrating it and letting some of that water evaporate out until it's a decent sculpting consistency. Later we'll mix in some temper. All those big clay nodules will just crumble as they absorb water. This is called slaking. I'm driving to a different area now to find some temper. In this area, there's lots of exposed soil on these hills. That's always a decent indicator of clay. In this case, it's not so much clay, it's more sand. That's because as we get closer to this temper source, there's more ancient sand dunes that have been covered over. Now where there's cut banks, there's pure sand under the topsoil. In this sheer cliff, you can see lots of bird holes. Birds can't really dig into really dense clay, but whatever species this is can dig into sand cliffs. These cliffs are made of more than 90% sand with just a little bit of clay aggregating them together. Large blocks of compressed fine sand fall out of these cliffs regularly, just like the clay cliffs. Here's a pile of the fine white sand. In these chunks, every particle is very fine. I don't even need to sift it. That's a great source of fine temper. Sometimes I'll use coarser temper for things like cook pots though. I'll take home a few compressed blocks like this. They break up very easily. Coming down from one of those cliffs is this hill. It's covered in a very quartzy, coarse sand. This is a good option too, but it needs a lot of sifting. Most of the sand in this bucket is not usable, so I'll sift out what is small enough to use. This compressed sand breaks up really easily, as you can see. It's not like sandstone. It's not really a stone at all right now. Just sand glued together with a little clay and a lot of pressure. These blocks are so high quality, just pressing them through a sieve to break up the chunks, that's all it takes. And everything in the block is made fine enough for temper. Sometimes I use a mortar and pestle to help break up some of these chunks. It just gives me more consistent results, and it helps keep things within the primitive spirit of the whole project. Here's that coarse temper, sifting it through. Everything that's too big, I throw out to my chickens and they'll use it as grit. It helps them digest food. So nothing's really going to waste, even though only a small fraction of the sand that's actually in this bucket is usable as clay temper. You can see the difference between how fine the cliff sand is versus that coarse quartz sand. After hydrating that clay, leaving it in the bucket for a few days, letting that water evaporate off, scooped all that clay out of the bucket, and now it's a decent sculpting consistency. I just need to mix it thoroughly and add that temper. This clay has a good amount of organic matter, so mixing it thoroughly so there's no pockets of debris really helps with the overall quality of the clay and the projects you make from it. Now we add the temper. I've dampened this sand a bit because dry sand would dry out the clay quite a bit. It would take a clay of good sculpting consistency and make it too dry as it absorbs water from that clay. So by damping the sand beforehand and then mixing it into the clay, you maintain whatever sculpting consistency it was originally brought to. One thing I do is I slap the clay ball between each of my hands, rotating it a little bit as I go, and this gradually creates a very even pancake. You do this gradually instead of just pressing it into a pancake all at once because this reduces cracking. Moving clay a little bit at a time allows the clay to stretch with the movements. If it's moved too much at once, especially if it doesn't have quite enough water, it'll crack. Making a pancake like this allows me to spread some sand, roll it all back up, continue mixing. I'll do this until all the sand is completely absorbed. Oftentimes when your clay is fully tempered and all that sand is mixed in, you can't even notice it there. It depends on how fine the sand is and how much you have to add. This particular clay likes to have about 25% sand added, meaning 25% of the total clay body volume. So in other words, this clay now is 3 parts clay to 1 part sand. If you mix it by flattening it out and rolling it, be sure to roll it a bit forcefully because you don't want to trap a bunch of air bubbles into the clay. Now, it's not as big of a deal as modern potters would have you believe, especially because this temper makes the clay more porous. So in the firing process, any air bubbles that expand because of the heat can easily dissipate that air because of the porosity of the clay. But even so, having air bubbles in your clay makes weak spots, so it's good to minimize it. With that clay totally mixed, I pull off a small ball, and I'm just making a small pinch bowl. I press both of my thumbs into the center of the clay ball and slowly start rotating it just a little bit at a time. Like I said before, you don't want to move the clay too much at once or it'll crack. Gradually, as it rotates, the shape of the bowl is made. You can always fix those cracks, but it tends to mess with the shape of the clay, so it's easier just to have good technique and not cause a lot of cracking in the first place. Having really well hydrated clay helps with this. In this instance, this clay was a little more hydrated than I'm used to, and that reduced its wet strength, which is how well it holds up its own shape when you're sculpting it. With the bowl created, I smooth out the inside and make a more refined shape using a gourd scraper. This is simply a piece of a gourd that's been carved into the shape of a kidney. This was a common tool in the American Southwest and very versatile. Using this tool, professional potters can make hand-built pottery that's just about as symmetrical as anything thrown on a wheel. Because this clay was so wet, I put it out in the sun for a few minutes, just so it could firm up a little more. This will help it hold its shape better as I handle it. In the meantime, I decided to start a few more of these lamps so I could fire a bunch at once. Using the same process as here, pinch out the bowl and use the round end of the scraper to refine the shape of the inside. Now once these lamps firm up a bit, we'll refine the shape of the outside a little more too. Now I use a knife. You could just as well use a stick or your own finger, and I cut out a little plug in the bottom. This lamp has a central post, and I need to be able to fit it through the hole and smooth it over on the underside of the lamp, rather than just sticking it to the bottom of the bowl. This creates the strongest connection. I roll out a little worm of clay, almost as thick as my pinky, and that becomes the post. Stick it through, squish it in really well, and flatten that bottom over. Then I use the scraper and a little water to blend it all in on the bottom. Anytime you use the scraper, you want to be using it with water. That allows it to glide seamlessly over the clay, shaping it as it goes. If it's too dry, it will tear the clay as it goes along and leave a rough surface. Now, to make the inside look a little better and hold a little stronger, I roll another small worm out and I squish it in around the transition between the post and the bowl. You'll see a better example of this in a second. Now the transition between the two is seamless. In all, I made 6 lamps. After sculpting each one, I set it out to dry a little bit. Now I've come back to that first bowl I've made, and we'll turn it into a lamp as well. Now that it's firmed up a bit, it'll be much easier to work. Here I have a little clay scoop, actually made from this same clay, one of my original test pieces from it. I use that to hold water. I get a little water on the knife before I drill out that hole. That helps it cut cleanly through without the clay sticking to it. Same process, but better angles to see it all. Roll out your post, stick it all the way through. I like to leave a flat top on these posts too. Helps prevent the cordage material we'll add later on from falling off the top. Now I added my little worm around the base of the post. I dampen my finger and just blend it into the post and the bowl. Go to the underside of the bowl, smooth that end of the post over so it's a rivet now. Blend it all flat and smooth with that scraper. Now I'll use my knife and trim up the edges of all the lamps. It's very hard to sculpt the rim of a bowl completely even. So most people leave it wonky, then go back and trim it as evenly as possible a little bit later, usually after it's set up a little more. In this case, you can see the clay cuts nicely. That's because this clay has been allowed to set up a little. And then use a damp finger and smooth out the edges of the rim. Now that these lamps have set up a bit, I use the straight edge of the scraper, dampening it first, and I use that to scrape down the high spots and fill up the low spots on the outside of the bowl. This gives you a much more smooth surface. I didn't spend too much time on these lamps. I want them to be nice and smooth to the touch, but they don't need to be polished to a mere finish, and they don't need to be a perfect semicircle. An asymmetrical lamp will light up a room just as much as the most symmetrical, perfectly shaped lamp. So I put enough time into it, but not too much. And as you can see, they look pretty good. I set them out in the shade now to dry a little slower, and I'll leave them like this overnight. Now it's the next day. You can see these have dried a fair bit. It's important that they've dried in the shade and not the sun. The sun dries them too quick and can cause them to crack. Now the outsides of all these bowls are really rough. That's because as clay dries, the clay particles, which are platelet shaped, start pointing straight out, giving a sandpaper feel to them. Now if you catch it in the leather hard stage, you can use a smooth rock and smooth out the exterior of your pottery. This will leave a really smooth finish, and then as it dries more, you can continue to smooth it out, and this is called burnishing. You can ultimately do it to a point where it's reflective. I just do a little smoothing with these lamps because I want them to feel good to the touch, but I see no point in spending hours burnishing them. In this case, they've gotten a little too dry, so I'm going to have to dampen them back. All you do is you get some water on your hand, rub it all around the entire surface of the pottery that you want to smooth. Keep gliding your hand over it until a thin layer of slip forms over top. Slip is very watery clay. This slip will go over top all the temper. That way when you smooth the pottery with the stone, the temper will be pushed into the walls of the clay, and there'll be a thin layer of slip burnished in over top. And this just does a little bit to leave a really nice feel to the clay surface. I found this rock at a beach in Washington. It's so smooth because it's ocean tumbled. You can instead use a polished rock that was polished in a rock tumbler. I like using what I can from nature though. I've had this stone for years. At this point, it's my burnishing stone. Thoroughly go over every surface. Try and get any low spots that you see too. I only burnish the outside and the rim. I don't burnish the inside. That'd be difficult because of the post in there. And also, it's going to be filled with fuel. So I figure there's not much point to it. So I go over the whole surface again with that smooth stone. This will make it really nice and silky, almost like the pottery is glazed. This was very common on pottery that was handled a lot, or that was meant to be really beautiful. Only the most utilitarian items weren't smoothed. After making those lamps, I also made this rattle for my baby boy. It's a bighorn sheep. I put a couple of clay balls on the inside before closing it all up, so the body of the sheep is hollow. It should fire nicely too. Now it's time to build the fire. I have to cross over to this island in the middle of the river where all the dry wood hasn't been taken up already for other people's fires. When I'm firing pottery on my own time, I gather up dry wood just from the surroundings, but when I film, I often just buy firewood. It makes everything go a little faster and I'm often on a time crunch. In this case, I used a little bit of both, but either works just fine. I split down the kiln-dried firewood to about 2 or 3 inches in diameter. I don't want many pieces bigger than that because these smaller diameter pieces get better airflow around them and create a hotter, oxidizing fire. This helps you get more bright orange and red colors. To start out, we need to build our primary fire. This is to warm up the pottery, drive out any last bits of moisture, and then we'll build a second fire. Once the pottery is too hot to hold and has been at that temperature for about a half hour, I'll move it into the bed of coals and we'll build up our secondary fire where the pots are actually fired and become ceramic. Yeah, I cheat and use a lighter sometimes, just for the sake of brevity. I could start every fire with a hand drill or bow drill or flint and steel, but lately I've just got really busy work days and needed to be fast. So I hope you'll forgive this particular lack of primitive tech. This first fire is a log cabin style. It takes longer to burn down than a teepee fire. I just set up some rocks around the fire and use them to prop up the pottery. Here you can see that sheep is all dry. I really love how it turned out. I'm excited for it to come out of the fire. This will be the first rattle I ever made. I love that sheep design. I'm gonna make rattles like this for each of my children in the future. You can see I set up the lamps so the opening is actually facing the fire. This helps them heat more evenly, and to further help them, I rotate them about a quarter turn every now and then. I make sure I turn all of them the same direction every time. That way I don't get stuck turning them back and forth and heating up one part more than the others. After about 15 minutes of preheating, I move them really close to the fire so they can get really hot to the touch. I keep rotating them every now and then as that fire burns down to a bed of coals. Now I carefully make sure that they're really hot to the touch. Now it's time to bring them into the fire. I put them in upside down, all stacked against each other. They all help protect each other that way and make sure I get consistent coloring on them. If one is buried in coals and the others aren't, that one will turn mostly black from absorbing carbon. So by piling them together, you can get brighter, more consistent colors. Then I put that ram on top because I don't mind if it gets more smoke clouds on it. Next, we build a teepee fire. I build a teepee fire because it takes in a lot of oxygen, so the center of a teepee fire gets hotter than some other types of fire lays. Anything I can do to just get those temperatures up. I want this pottery to get at least 1300 degrees. The hotter, the better. Technically, it needs a minimum of 1100 degrees Fahrenheit to change from clay to ceramic. But depending on the clay, the hotter you get it, the harder it fires. So I always try to lay out the fire in a way that will produce the most heat possible. In this case, I just use a lot of fuel. Usually when I build up this secondary fire, the wood does not burst into flames until I want it to. This time, it immediately started burning with the first couple of pieces I put on. And that's all right. I know these pots were preheated sufficiently, so I'm not worried about them taking on too much thermal shock and cracking. That's why it's important to do a thorough preheat. If this had happened and the pots weren't sufficiently warmed up, or if they didn't have enough temper, then you could get some broken pots because of that sudden flame heating them up so dramatically. It's the middle of the day, it is hot on this riverbank, but I have to tend this fire, so a little break in hydration is going to have to be enough. After about 30 minutes, that fire is burned down to coals and all the pottery is buried. So I start digging through. Everything is still really hot. The pottery is probably still 800 or 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and this coal bed is outputting a ton of heat. So you need some long sticks to be able to pull the pots out without singeing the hairs off your arms. Some people use welding gloves, so that could be a really good way to go too. This firing was totally successful. Nothing broke, not so much as a single hairline fracture on any of these lamps. They all ring beautifully. It's always fun to see what tone each piece of pottery will ring at when you tap it. Got some good orange colors and some pretty fire clouds. And that bighorn sheep rattle turned out perfectly. With that pottery fired successfully, now I'll show you how to set up these lamps. First things first, you need some twine or natural fiber cordage of some sort. This can be cotton thread or butcher twine. And you need to wrap the clay post in the lamps with it. This creates a very large wick. The clay post acts as a structure for the wick. It's a great design because it's basically a permanent wick, with you only needing to replace the wrapping every now and then. I tie a clove hitch at the base of the post, and I wrap from the bottom all the way up, making sure each wrap touches the one below it. This cotton twine will draw the fuel up so it can be burned, and because of the width of the post, it creates a very large flame, off-putting a lot of light. Once I get to the top, I wrap it back down on itself, and then finish it off with a simple half hitch. Now I've got to add fuel. I'll use tallow for this. Tallow is the rendered fat from large animals like cows, bison, and deer. We're going to melt it down right in this lamp. And to do that, I'm actually going to use another lamp. This lamp is actually just a clay bowl filled with beeswax. As the beeswax was solidifying, I put a split stick wrapped in twine right into it to create essentially that same post and wick. This works really well, but as it burns down, that wood will burn up as well, so it needs to be replaced when you burn through the fuel. And in that way, you can turn any bowl into a fat lamp. I have this steel cooking trivet that I forged a while back, made for cooking in a pot over coals. The red clay lamp conveniently fits underneath of it, and so I'll warm up the freshly fired lamp and melt that tallow directly in it. And once it's all liquid, I set it aside to cool. I just need to get all that fat melted and consolidated in the bowl of the lamp. Now you don't have to wait for it to cool to light it up, but that's what I did. Allowing it to cool makes it convenient for moving around because you're not going to spill hot fuel. Now with a decent flame, it still takes a little effort to get these lamps lit up. It helps if you end the wick wrapping, so there's a little tail sticking off that you can ignite first, like the wick of a candle. That will start burning pretty easily with a flame, and it'll spread to the rest of the wick. That's the easiest way I've found, so that's how I tie the wick now. You can see how tall and brightly this burns. 1 or 2 of these in a tent will be all the light you need. I've been able to read and write in the dark under the light of these lamps. The one downside about tallow is it is a rather smoky fuel, but you never know, there could come a time where it's the only fuel you have on hand. You could always swap it out for olive oil, beeswax, paraffin wax. Any oil or fat from the kitchen will work for this. Crisco, canola oil, even butter you could melt into it like tallow, and it would burn all the same. I hope you try making one of these lamps. It's a really fun project. Really fun to have some of these lamps around. If you want to burn them in the house, I'd suggest filling them with beeswax because that burns very clean. It puts out almost no smoke and it smells nice. So with that, now you know how to make a primitive oil lamp that can take liquid or solid fuel. I hope you try this out and take them camping with you. Keep a couple around for emergency preparedness. Make them from clay that you harvested from the earth, and let this ancient craft light your way. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.